AXT Ohio Valley Forest. Day, May 12, 1796. Sound, hacking of machetes, insects, horses, nickering, labored breathing. The air is green and solid, humid. Elias Caird, surveyor for the Ohio Company, wipes sweat and grime from his face. His buckskin shirt is dark with it. For weeks, his Gunter's chain has snagged on briars, his compass has been thrown off by magnetic deposits, and his men have been on edge, wary of Shawnee or Delaware hunting parties. His job is to cut the wilderness into clean, sellable squares, tame it. He parts a final screen of thick foliage, stepping ahead of his chain carriers, and stops cold. The world falls silent. The forest has vanished. He is standing on the edge of something that does not belong. Before him is a vast, open plain, dominated not by trees, but by massive, sloping walls of earth. They are perfectly straight. He turns his head, his eye following a rampart that runs for hundreds of yards before connecting to a perfect, enormous circle. He stumbles forward, his boots sinking into the rich soil of the embankment. A crew member, Harris, breaks through the brush behind him. Harris, panting, "Lieutenant, what is—" Harris sees it. His voice dies in his throat. Cade raises a trembling hand. He's looking at an octagon, a precise 8-sided figure connected by a corridor to another circle. Each side of the octagon is over 500 feet long. The scale is monumental. It's a city, a fortress, a cathedral, but it's empty, and it's made of earth, Caird whispering, Who built this? Introduction and promise. Narration. What Elias Caird stumbled upon in 1796 wasn't a fluke. It was one of hundreds of complex, massive earthworks scattered across the Ohio Valley. When American pioneers and surveyors, men like Rufus Putnam and Caleb Atwater, began to map these sites, they faced a reality-bending mystery. These were not crude forts. They were precise geometric diagrams etched into the landscape. Perfect circles, 20-acre squares, and complex octagons, all aligned to the heavens with a precision that 19th-century mathematics struggled to explain. The sheer scale suggested a vast, organized, and vanished civilization. The question of who built them and how would ignite one of the darkest and most persistent myths in American history. By the end of this journey, you will understand the impossible mathematics embedded in these mounds and uncover the identity of the true, forgotten architects of ancient America. Title sequence. Section 1. The Silent Cities. Narration. When the first American settlers crossed the Appalachians after the Revolutionary War, they were not entering an empty wilderness. They were stepping into a graveyard of giants. They came for farmland, for the famously rich soil of the Scioto and Muskingum River valleys, and as they cleared the dense forests, the trees gave way to structure. In Marietta, Ohio, founded in 1788 by the Ohio Company of Associates, the pioneers led by General Rufus Putnam found their new town site was already occupied, but not by the living. Putnam, a seasoned military engineer who had built fortifications for George Washington, immediately recognized the scale of the works. He saw massive 30-foot-high truncated pyramids, which he called temples. He saw a vast, elevated square with precise gateways. He saw a graded sacred way leading down to the river. His military mind assessed them. These were not random piles of dirt. They were engineered. But Putnam was baffled. He knew the local tribes, the Delaware, the Shawnee, the Miami. In the view of these 18th-century settlers, these were migratory bands of hunters, living in wigwams, engaged in small-scale farming. The cognitive dissonance was immediate and profound. The people they saw in the forest could not, in their minds, be the people who had raised these cities. Further west, at a site near modern-day Newark, the scale defied all belief. Here, the earthworks covered over 4 square miles. Imagine walking into a complex centered on a great circle 1,200 feet in diameter, large enough to fit the Colosseum of Rome inside it. The walls enclosing it were not simple mounds. They were a 14-foot-high embankment with a 7-foot-deep moat inside the circle, a design that seemed intentionally anti-defensive. From this great circle, a vast, walled avenue led to an even stranger complex, a 20-acre square, its sides perfectly aligned, connected to a 50-acre octagon. The numbers were staggering. Archaeologists would later calculate that the Newark earthworks alone required moving over 7 million cubic feet of earth. This was a project on the scale of the Great Pyramid of Giza. And it was done, one woven basket load at a time, by a people who supposedly had no wheel, no draft animals, and no metal tools. As settlers pushed onward, they kept finding them. The Miamisburg Mound, a conical giant 68 feet high. The Serpent Mound, a quarter-mile-long effigy of a snake uncoiling on a hilltop. The High Bank Works, a perfect circle and octagon combination. The landscape of Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois was revealed to be a vast, interconnected network of sacred geometry. This discovery did not inspire wonder. It inspired a deep, unsettling fear. The silence of these sites was deafening. They were clearly ancient. Massive oak trees, hundreds of years old, grew from their summits. They were clearly built by a massive, organized, and intelligent population. And that population was gone. The settlers, standing in the shadow of these monuments, were faced with a paradox. They were building their new republic on lands they believed were virgin, inhabited only by savages. These silent cities of Earth proved that a powerful civilization had been there first. If the ancestors of the local Native Americans had not built this, then who had? Section 2. The Invention of a Lost Race. Narration. The mystery of the mounds was not just an academic puzzle, it was a crisis of conscience for the young American Republic. The nation's narrative, its manifest destiny, was built on the premise of taming an untamed continent. But these earthworks were silent, profound evidence that a great civilization had already risen and fallen in the very lands being settled. This fact was deeply inconvenient. If the savage tribes they were actively displacing were the descendants of these brilliant architects, it would mean America was not just clearing wilderness. It was destroying the heirs of a sophisticated, ancient culture. A new theory was needed, a theory that would sever the link between the people living in the Ohio Valley and the people who had built the silent cities. Enter Caleb Atwater, a postmaster, politician, and self-taught antiquarian from Circleville, Ohio, a town literally built inside two massive, ancient circles. Atwater was commissioned by the newly formed American Antiquarian Society. His mission, to be the first to conduct a scientific and systematic study of these ruins. In 1820, he published his findings in Archaeologia Americana. It would become one of the most influential and damaging texts in American archaeology. Atwater was a man of his time. He climbed the mounds, he measured their dimensions, he excavated artifacts, he unearthed beautifully crafted copper ornaments, intricate mica cutouts, and polished stone pipes carved in the shape of animals. He saw this artistry, and then he looked at the local Shawnee, and he made a judgment. Sound of a page turning. In his report, Atwater wrote, "We are constrained to believe that the authors of our ancient works belonged to a race of men different from the present Indians of North America." He argued that the local tribes showed no traditions in their vague and idle songs concerning the authors of these works. He declared with the full authority of science that the ancestors of the modern Native Americans were rude savages who had not the industry, patience, and skill for such monumental constructions. Instead, Atwater proposed a new romantic and tragic narrative. The mound builders, he argued, were a lost race. They were a vast, civilized, and ancient people, perhaps related to the Hindus of India, the Egyptians, or even the lost tribes of Israel. They were an agricultural society, ruled by a king who held in his hands the sovereign power. They were, in essence, everything the 19th century American admired: industrious, organized, civilized. And according to Atwater's theory, this noble race had been wiped out. They were not ancestors. They were victims, and their killers, the present Indians. In Atwater's narrative, waves of savage hunters had swept down from the north, overwhelming the peaceful, civilized mound builders in a brutal prehistoric war. The savages had won, extinguishing the light of civilization in the Ohio Valley and plunging the continent into darkness. This theory was a sensation. It solved everything for the American settler. It meant the earthworks were not Native American heritage, but rather the monuments of a different people. It transformed the act of displacement. Settlers weren't stealing land from the tribes. They were avenging the long-dead mound builders. They were reclaiming the land from the savage interlopers and restoring it to civilization. The lost race myth became dogma. It was taught in schools. It was preached from pulpits. It was the official history. For decades, this convenient lie would define the American past. It erased the true creators from their own story, turning their greatest achievements into an indictment against them. But even as the myth took hold, a few dissenting voices began to ask a different question. They stopped looking for lost tribes and Hindus and started looking at the geometry itself. And what they found was even more impossible than a lost race. Section 3. The Blueprint of the Moon. Narration. This new line of inquiry began not with romantics, but with pragmatists. In the 1830s and 40s, two brothers, Charles and James Whittlesey, both professional surveyors and geologists, began to map the works. Unlike Caleb Atwater, they were not looking for a lost race. They were looking at angles, distances, and elevations. They brought their transits, their Gunter's chains, and their skeptical mathematical minds to the ramparts. What they found shattered the rude, savage narrative far more effectively than any artifact. The geometry wasn't just symbolic, it was precise, frighteningly precise. Let's return to the colossal Newark earthworks. When Whittlesey's team, and later surveyors for the Smithsonian Institution, put their instruments on the 20-acre Great Square, they found it wasn't just a square. Its four sides were almost perfectly straight, each measuring approximately 1,080 feet long. Its corners were not close to 90 degrees. They were 90 degrees. This wasn't a palisade paced out by foot. It was a blueprint, executed on a landscape scale, with a standard unit of measurement that the surveyors could only guess at. But the true mind-bending discovery lay in the site's most famous feature, the observatory circle and the attached octagon. The circle is a masterpiece, a near-perfect ring of earth 154 feet in diameter. The surveyors noted something incredible. The diameter of this observatory circle was almost identical to the length of the diagonal of the Great Square, located a mile away. This was not a coincidence. This was a deliberate, sophisticated geometric principle. The relationship between the diagonal of a square and the diameter of a circle, encoded in millions of tons of earth. It proved the entire complex was a single, unified design. But the octagon was the key. It's not a true octagon, where all sides and angles are equal. The 19th century surveyors mapped it and were baffled. The walls were skewed, the gateways seemed placed just slightly off-center. To them, it looked like a failed attempt at pure geometry. They were wrong. It wasn't a failed attempt at geometry. It was a perfect success at something else entirely. The builders weren't just mathematicians. They were astronomers. Sound of wind over an open field, a faint, low hum. Imagine standing in the center of the observatory circle at dawn on a specific day. You look through the arrow-straight corridor connecting the circle to the octagon. On most days, you see nothing but the central gateway. But if you wait, and wait, for years, you will see the moon rise in perfect alignment with that gateway. This isn't the simple summer solstice. This is something infinitely more complex. The moon's path through the sky is complicated, wobbling in a lunar standstill cycle that takes 18.6 years to complete. The gateways of the Newark octagon are not random. They are a precise celestial calculator. One gateway marks the northernmost point the moon ever rises. Another marks its southernmost rise. Others capture the northernmost and southernmost setting of the moon. To build this, the architects, now known as the Hopewell culture, had to do the impossible. First, they had to observe the sky night after night, for decades, likely generations, to isolate this 18.6-year cycle. Second, they had to record that data. With no written language, this knowledge had to be passed down perfectly, perhaps in song, or ritual, or memory. Third, they had to translate that celestial data into a massive engineering blueprint. They needed a standard unit of measurement, a command of advanced geometry, and a social structure capable of mobilizing thousands of workers over years to move millions of cubic feet of earth with no wheel, no metal, and no draft animals. This discovery of high science, of a Stonehenge in the heart of America, should have ended the lost race myth. It did the opposite. To the 19th century mind, this was the final nail in the coffin. If the mound builders were brilliant astronomers and geometers, they proved they couldn't be Indians. Surely this knowledge had to have come from the old world. The search for the lost race only intensified. And all the while, the real evidence was being systematically destroyed. Section 4. The Vanishing Landscapes. Narration. The search for the lost race wasn't just an intellectual pastime, it was a license for destruction. As the 19th century wore on, the very progress that defined America became the primary executioner of its ancient past. The myth had severed the mounds from the living Native Americans. They were now just obstacles. Relics of an unknown, extinct people, they had no protectors. The toll was catastrophic. In the fertile river valleys, farmers found the dark, rich earth of the mounds was perfect for planting corn. They hitched their plows and, year after year, dragged the ramparts down, one furrow at a time. Conical mounds were leveled to fill in gullies. Great circles were breached to make way for roads. Towns were the worst offenders. The citizens of Circleville, Ohio, the town Caleb Atwater had lived in, decided their town's namesake was inconvenient. The original layout had followed the ancient ramparts, fitting streets and houses inside the two concentric circles. Sound of hammering, sawing, wagon wheels on dirt. But by the 1830s, the townspeople complained. They wanted a normal town, a modern American grid. So the town trustees passed an ordinance, and in an act of staggering civic vandalism, they began the systematic demolition of the 1,100-foot-wide circle and the 900-foot-wide square it was attached to. They brought in wagons, shovels, and scrapers. They carted away the sacred walls, dumping the earth to fill basements and level lots. By 1856, one of the most unique earthworks on the continent was gone, erased to make a standard town square. Elsewhere, the myth fueled a different kind of fire, greed. These were not just forts, the stories went. They were the tombs of kings, filled with treasure. Money diggers, armed with shovels and fueled by fantasy, descended on the mounds. They weren't archaeologists, they were looters. Imagine a burial mound on a bluff overlooking the Scioto River, a sacred place where generations of a people had laid their leaders to rest. The looters tear into its heart. They shatter 2,000-year-old pottery, snap intricate ceremonial blades, and scatter human bones like gravel, all in a frantic search for gold or silver, metals the builders rarely even used. They find a burial, a figure laid on a platform of beaten mica. They see the glimmer of copper on the skeleton's chest, a breastplate. They rip it off. They find a string of freshwater pearls, now chalky with age. They crush them underfoot. A carved stone pipe, the effigy of a beaver, is tossed aside. This was the archaeology of the era. A chaotic, destructive treasure hunt, ruining context, destroying evidence, and desecrating graves. What we see today, the preserved sites like Newark or Serpent Mound, are the lucky ones. They are the 1%. For every site that was saved, hundreds, perhaps thousands, were ploughed flat, built over, or looted into oblivion before they were ever measured, mapped, or understood. The true architects were being erased from the land a second time. But this destruction finally triggered an alarm. In Washington, D.C., a new institution, the Smithsonian, was beginning to take its mission seriously. And its intellectual leader was a man who detested pseudoscience. His name was John Wesley Powell. Powell was a force of nature. A one-armed Union veteran who had lost his limb at Shiloh, he was the man who had first charted the Colorado River through the Grand Canyon. He was a geologist, an ethnologist, and above all, a pragmatist. He had spent years living with and documenting the Ute, the Paiute, and other tribes of the American West. When he looked at the local tribes and then at the mounds, he didn't see a disconnect. He saw a continuum. The lost race myth to Powell was not just bad science. It was a vicious and misleading lie used to justify the brutal displacement of the very people he was studying. In 1881, as head of the new Bureau of American Ethnology, Powell decided to end the debate. He would use the power of the federal government to solve the mound builder question with overwhelming, undeniable science. He needed a field commander. He chose a man named Cyrus Thomas, and in a brilliant move, Powell chose a man who was, at the time, a firm believer in the lost race theory. Thomas, an entomologist and naturalist, was convinced the works were built by a non-Indian civilization. Powell didn't care about Thomas's beliefs. He cared about his methodology. He gave Thomas a simple, monumental task. Forget the speculation. Forget the lost tribes of Israel. Go out, survey all the mounds, excavate them systematically, record everything you find, and follow the evidence, no matter where it leads. In 1882, the Mound Exploration Division began its work. It would become the most ambitious archaeological project in American history. For the next 12 years, Thomas's teams fanned out across 21 states, digging into more than 2,000 mounds. They weren't looking for proof of a theory. They were just looking, and what they found, buried in the earth, was not what Cyrus Thomas expected at all. Section 5. The Report on the Mounds. Narration. Cyrus Thomas's teams were not treasure hunters. They were data collectors. They moved with scientific slowness. When they entered a mound, they didn't just dig a hole in the center. They sliced it like a loaf of bread, recording the stratigraphy, the precise layers of earth. They mapped the location of every single object before it was moved. They found pottery. They found spear points. They found woven textiles, preserved by contact with copper. They found charred seeds. They found skeletons. And as the data poured in from Ohio, Tennessee, Wisconsin, and Arkansas, a pattern began to emerge. It was not the pattern Thomas expected. First, there was the negative evidence. In 2,000 mounds, his teams found not one Old World artifact. No Hebrew tablets, no Viking runes, no Egyptian hieroglyphs. Every single item, every pipe, every pot, every arrowhead, was unequivocally 100% North American in its origin, material, and style. The lost race of civilized invaders had apparently forgotten to bring anything from home, but the positive evidence was the bombshell. Sound of a trowel scraping packed earth. In a mound in Tennessee, a team unearthed a set of polished stone objects carved with intricate symbols. Thomas, looking at his field notes, was stunned. He recognized them. They were almost identical in form, though more elaborate, to ceremonial objects still being used by Muskogean-speaking tribes in the southeast. In Arkansas, they found pottery with swirling designs that clearly echoed the artistic traditions of the living Caddo people. In Ohio, in the very heart of mound builder territory, they found carved stone pipes. And when they compared them to the pipes being smoked by the 19th century Cherokee or Shawnee, the lineage was undeniable. The art forms had changed, they had evolved, but they were clearly part of the same continuous cultural stream. The mound builders hadn't been exterminated by the savages, they were the same people. The final irrefutable link came not from digging, but from reading. Thomas's team scoured the accounts of the very first European explorers, men like Hernando de Soto, who had marched through the southeast in the 1540s. And what did De Soto's chroniclers describe? They described encountering the Natchez people, a powerful, sophisticated tribe. They described them living in large, fortified towns. They described a paramount chief, the Great Sun, who lived atop a massive, 30-foot-high, truncated mound. They had witnessed the mound-builder culture, still living, still functioning. The lost race wasn't lost. It had been decimated by European diseases, its social structures shattered, its people scattered. The survivors, the Cherokee, the Choctaw, the Muskogee, the Shawnee, were the direct descendants. Caleb Atwater had been profoundly, disastrously wrong. He had stood in Ohio, looking at the Shawnee, and claimed they had no traditions of the mounds. He was wrong because he never truly asked. Or more likely, he didn't listen. In 1894, after 12 years of work, Cyrus Thomas published his findings. It was a 730-page behemoth, simply titled Report on the Mound Explorations of the Bureau of American Ethnology. Thomas, the man who had started as a believer in the lost race, wrote the final definitive conclusion. Sound of a heavy book closing. The theory that the mounds were the work of a lost race, he wrote, is unsupported by any facts. The links connecting the mound builders and the modern Indians are so numerous and well established that archaeologists are justified in accepting the conclusion that the two are one and the same people. The science was settled. The myth was, officially, dead. The mound builders were given back their identity. They were Native Americans, but this solution only opened a new set of questions. The academics had named them the Hopewell culture, after a farm in Ohio where many artifacts were found. But who were they? How did a society of hunter-gatherers, without cities or kings, create a continental network of sacred geometry? The answer wasn't just in what they built, it was in why. Section 6. The Interaction Sphere. Narration. Cyrus Thomas had given the mounds back to their rightful creators, but in doing so, he deepened the central paradox. How did a people without a centralized state, without writing, without kings or standing armies, accomplish these monumental engineering and astronomical feats? The answer, archaeologists realized, was that the Hopewell were not an empire. There was no single capital, no emperor on a mound throne issuing orders. They were a culture, a shared system of belief so powerful it bound disparate, semi-nomadic clans together across a continent. The proof was not in what they built, but in what they gathered. When archaeologists like Warren K. Moorhead excavated the Hopewell type site in Ohio, they found burials of astonishing richness. These were not the graves of warriors. They were the graves of spiritual leaders, of shamans, of clan elders. And they were buried with the entire continent. Sound of a soft brush on delicate material. In one burial, a man was laid to rest on a funeral platform, covered in a sheet of glimmering, paper-thin mica. That mica was quarried, by hand, from the Blue Ridge Mountains of North Carolina, over 400 miles away. He wore a breastplate of beaten, polished copper. That copper was mined near Lake Superior, 600 miles to the north. Beside him lay ceremonial knives, massive leaf-shaped blades of jet-black obsidian. The chemical signature of that volcanic glass matched one source, and one source only: Obsidian Cliff, in what is today Yellowstone National Park, Wyoming, over 1,500 miles to the west. And in his hand he held a cup, fashioned from a massive whelk shell, which had begun its journey in the warm waters of the Gulf of Mexico, 800 miles to the south. This was not trade as we know it. This was a religious economy. Archaeologists call it the Hopewell Interaction Sphere. It was an invisible network connecting thousands of small villages, from New York to Missouri, from Florida to Ontario. They were bound not by political rule, but by a shared cosmology. The objects weren't for utility. The obsidian blades were too large and brittle to be used as tools. The copper was too soft for weapons. Their value was sacred. They were physical manifestations of a spiritual world. And the mounds? They were the reason for this network. They were not cities. People did not live in the Newark earthworks. They were cathedrals. They were pilgrimage sites. They were the neutral ground where these disparate clans, speaking different languages, could travel hundreds of miles to come together. They came to bury their most revered dead, to arrange marriages, to exchange these sacred materials, and to watch the heavens. This is the key to the impossible geometry. The 18.6-year lunar cycle marked by the Newark octagon wasn't just abstract science, it was a clock, a celestial scale summons. It was the master calendar for these great continent-spanning gatherings. Imagine you are a Hopewell traveler, leaving your village in the dense forests of Michigan. You carry a pouch of copper. You don't have a written calendar. How do you know when the great festival will be held? You know because the moon tells you. When the moon begins to rise at its northernmost point, you know, it is time. You begin your journey. The geometry of the mounds wasn't just a reflection of the cosmos, it was a tool to harness it. It was the social glue that allowed a decentralized people to coordinate and focus their labor, basket by basket, on a scale that rivaled the pharaohs. They were a civilization built not on a king's command, but on a shared understanding of the moon. They flourished for 500 years. Their influence was supreme. Their mathematics were precise. Their art was sublime. And then, around 400 AD, it all just stops. The great earthworks fall silent. The continental trade in obsidian and mica ceases. The mounds are no longer built. The graves of the next generation are simple, lacking the exotic treasures of their ancestors. The lights of the Hopewell interaction sphere go out. The silence that Elias Cade would stumble upon 300 years later had begun. Why? Section 7. The Echo of the Builders. Narration. There is no sign of a great war, no evidence of a single catastrophic invasion that toppled the Hopewell world. The end of this impossible geometry was not a bang, it was a fade. Around 400 to 500 AD, the climate of North America began to shift. It became colder, wetter, and less predictable. This was the late antique Little Ice Age, a global event that stressed societies from Rome to Mesoamerica. For the Hopewell, whose entire system was likely underpinned by reliable harvests of native crops, this would have been a disaster. When food surpluses vanish, the social energy required to build monuments evaporates. The long-distance pilgrimages become too dangerous. The complex ritual gatherings become a luxury that can no longer be afforded. At the same time, a new transformative technology was spreading across the continent, the bow and arrow. This new weapon, far faster and more lethal than the traditional spear and atlatl, may have fundamentally changed the social dynamic. It made small group conflict more deadly. The world, perhaps, became more dangerous. The old system, this grand continental interaction sphere built on faith, ritual, and the moon, fractured. The belief that held it together dissolved. The people didn't die out. They adapted. They turned inward. They stopped building massive, shared space cathedrals and began building smaller, defensive, palisaded villages. The late woodland period began. The grand continental vision of the Hopewell gave way to a focus on local survival. The descendants of the geometers and astronomers became the very tribes the settlers would later encounter. The Shawnee, the Miami, the Potawatomi, the Delaware. The great earthworks were left to the forest. They were never forgotten. They remained sacred, but their purpose, their function as celestial clocks for a continental gathering, was lost. When Elias Cade and Caleb Atwater stumbled upon them, they were not seeing the ruins of a lost race. They were seeing the abandoned, silent cathedrals of their neighbors. Sound of wind, a sense of peace. Today the fight is one of preservation. The lost race myth, though scientifically dead for over a century, still echoes, fueling a persistent, romantic skepticism. But the evidence, etched in earth and aligned with the moon, is undeniable. In 2023, the Newark Earthworks, the complex with the perfect circle and the 18.6-year lunar octagon, was officially designated a UNESCO World Heritage Site. It was a global acknowledgement, centuries late, placing these impossible structures on the same level as Stonehenge, the pyramids of Giza, and the Acropolis of Athens. These mounds shouldn't exist, according to a narrative of convenient dismissal. But they do. They are not just geometry. They are a declaration written in the soil of Ohio of a truly American genius, a scientific and spiritual legacy that was almost erased by the very nation built on top of it. Scene end. Call to action. Narration. The story of the Hopewell Earthworks is a powerful reminder that history is not always written by the victors, but often over the vanquished. The greatest impossibility was not the geometry, but the myth that hid the truth in plain sight. What part of this ancient, brilliant system amazed you the most? Was it the 18.6-year lunar alignment or the continental trade network that built it? Let us know in the comments. If you found this history as vital as we do, please share this video with a friend and subscribe for more hidden stories rescued from the margins of the past.